Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the honor to serve as the president of Hunter College, where the American dream still comes true, both on campus and online. That dream is fully reflected in our college motto, Mihi Cura Futuri, the care of the future is mine, which we exemplified last week by graduating over 1,900 students who completed their coursework in this difficult time of a global pandemic. We thank all of you in the Hunter community for providing the emotional and financial support to get these future leaders over the finish line to this life milestone. Preparing for the future, of course, requires understanding the past and learning from it. If it's not quite true that history repeats itself, we do know it echoes, and wise indeed are those who listen for the signals. As many of you know, today is the 212th birthday of the man consistently ranked as our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, who fought to save American democracy and rid the country of its original sin, the stain of slavery. Roosevelt House is proud to have hosted a number of Lincoln-themed public programs over the years, which is not surprising given the status of our director, Harold Hoser, as one of the world's most prolific Lincoln scholars, having launched his tenure with us just after winning the coveted Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize in 2015. As Harold likes to remind us, FDR was also a tremendous Lincoln admirer. He read everything about Lincoln he could get his hands on. He quoted Lincoln extensively from the time he served as governor. And as president, FDR hired playwright Robert E. Sherwood, who won a Pulitzer for the drama Abe Lincoln in Illinois, to serve as a White House speechwriter and help him quote Lincoln to get America more involved in the fight against Hitler. FDR even gave a Gettysburg Address once, which, unlike Lincoln, I'm told, he actually wrote on a train. Tonight, Harold brings us a preview and backstage look at CNN's new 6-part documentary series called Lincoln, Divided We Stand, which premieres on Sunday. Harold served as one of its 2 historical consultants. The series charts a frank new path in assessing Lincoln's contributions and also some of his shortcomings in the fight to make sure a nation conceived in liberty extended freedom and equality to all. You won't want to miss the series. Tonight, Harold will lead a discussion with some of the experts whom you will see on screen in the CNN series. First is our good friend John Avlon, known as Phip, the senior political analyst for CNN, who appears every weekday morning with his brilliant and sometimes biting fact check on American politics. Phip is also a terrific author. His book, Washington's Farewell, The Founding Fathers' Warning to Future Generations, was popular and a critical triumph. Now he's working to finish his next book, Lincoln's Farewell, a timely analysis of Lincoln's final months. Phip, you are with us at Hunter this fall to interview Harold on his latest book, and tonight it's Harold's turn to ask the questions. Thanks so much for being a part of the Hunter family. Next, we're pleased to welcome Sidney Blumenthal, who served as a senior aide in the Clinton White House. But in recent years, Sid has turned to the subject of Lincoln. He is an author of an acclaimed multi-volume biography called The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln, 3 volumes and counting. He too appears as an on-air commentator in the new CNN series. Sid, thank you. It's good to have you back at Roosevelt House. Welcome back also to the distinguished Civil War scholar, Dr. Edna Green Medford of Howard University, where she is a professor of history and deputy provost for faculty affairs. Edna's writing include the instant classic Emancipating Lincoln, and she also served as a director of history at New York's African Burial Ground Project. Edna was also a historical advisor to the new CNN series. Edna, we are so glad you are with us. Finally, we're pleased to welcome the filmmaker who brought together all these experts and more, including historians, biographers, and unexpected commentators from Van Jones to Conan O'Brien. His name is John Hirsch, and he is a prolific producer who has done work for CNN, National Geographic, the Discovery Channel, A&E, and HBO. John, we're delighted to have you with us. Congratulations on this very significant new project. Harold, thank you so much for leading this conversation tonight. Your contributions to this series are clear, and I want to share your favorite moment in the series. In episode 1 of the CNN series, when Conan O'Brien starts telling a funny Lincoln story, the film cuts to our own Harold for the punchline. Let's all watch for it on Sunday. Well, Lincoln was a complex man, combining humor and sadness, forgiveness and determination. But anyone who has listened to the recent debates in Congress knows that he still occupies a unique pedestal on the American scene in both political parties. He's the leader everyone loves to quote because even in times of unrest, Lincoln still personifies the better angels of our nature. To explore Lincoln's lasting impact, I am pleased to turn this Lincoln's Birthday event over to our own leading Lincoln scholar, Harold Holzer. Thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thank you, President Rabb, for that lovely introduction. Happy Lincoln's birthday, everyone, and welcome virtually to Roosevelt House, which I'm sure our regulars know was the New York City home of Franklin Roosevelt, described aptly by President Rabb as an intense admirer of Lincoln, but also Eleanor Roosevelt, who once described Lincoln as the epitome of our idea of democracy. And here are both Roosevelts and some grandchildren visiting the Lincoln Memorial to lay a wreath on Lincoln's birthday 43 years ago. This is 1938. Well, 40 years later, we're again, as President Rabb said, hearing Lincoln's words on democracy being repeated by our new president, by members of Congress. Lincoln once said, and I think the only miscue in his writings, that the world would little note nor long remember what he said. That has clearly not turned out to be true. But at the same time we're hearing his words, we're also bearing witness to a fresh analysis of Lincoln's work and reputation, especially on issues of race. And that's one of the key focal points of the CNN documentary. So we're gathered to discuss this complex resurgence of Lincoln interest 2 days before the premiere of the CNN documentary Lincoln Divided We Stand, which has we said we'll explore this evening with three of my colleagues who appear in the film and our esteemed producer John Hirsch. So welcome John Avlon, Sidney Blumenthal, producer John Hirsch, and Edna Green Medford, whose voice I heard in that clip talking about perfection. We'll get to that, but I'm going to start the Q&A with John Hirsch because you've herded some big cats for this documentary. It's a diverse and pretty distinguished group of authors and scholars, and as we heard, more unexpected folks like Conan and Van Jones. So I want to know first, what inspired you to undertake the project? You've done a lot of projects in your relatively few years, speaking personally compared to me, but why this project and why the group that you assembled?
Thanks, Harold, for first of all for having me, and it's a complicated question with a complicated answer. We had done a terrific series for CNN several years ago on the history of the papacy and how the office of the papacy has shaped our world, and it did great for CNN and was a bit of a ratings hit, and that opened up the doors for some really collaborative development conversations with CNN. Which is a little different than the way you normally develop shows and try to sell them. It was really very much a conversation of, what can we do next together? And the conversation really started with sort of an anecdote, really, from well after Lincoln's assassination that revolved around Robert Lincoln and his treatment of his mother in her later years and her eventual trial for insanity. And during that conversation in the room with CNN, all the development executives kind of did one of these, which we call, the lean in moment, and it sort of opened up a conversation of, well, we didn't know that. What else don't we know about Lincoln? And then from there, Nancy Glass, my colleague and the other executive producer on the project, she and I just started riffing on a bunch of sort of fun facts about Lincoln that a lot of people in the room didn't know or weren't familiar with. And within a couple of weeks, we'd engaged in more formal conversations about what this could look like. And we got a development deal. And then I spent 4 months trying to learn as much as I possibly could about Lincoln. And as you all know better than I do, you can't learn Lincoln in 4 months. So one of my very first phone calls was to you, Harold, because I was familiar with your work and had started diving into several of your books. And we met in New York City, and from there it sort of opened up a conversation of who do I need to talk to be able to pull this off. And I think like most good producers who are tackling huge stories and that have such a historical context and so much impact on what we're living through today, you got to go to the experts, the people that have dedicated so much of their time and their lives and their work to the topic. And from there, just sort of trust that they know more than you'll ever know, and just engage in good conversations, be prepared for the interviews. And did the same thing when I went down to DC to meet with Edna, to tell her about the project before she committed to participating. And it really just from there kind of blossomed into a chain of introductions and communications. And I feel really good about the variety of people that we have in the film, and the surprising people that we have in the film.
Well, you've become pretty knowledgeable, I must say, in the last year and a half. Now we have to see for your next project whether you're able to press eject and move on. Along those lines, I am going to spend a second or a few seconds asking you a question I didn't expect to ask, but John inspired me. Some of you have been in the Lincoln field a long time, and I developed my interest when I was in 5th grade in a Queens, New York public school. But I don't know if I've ever asked any of you, much less all of you, what drew you to Lincoln from your various lives and specialties? Edna, we'll start with you.
Yeah, growing up, I never had an interest in Lincoln. I've often said that the only white people who adorned the walls of my parents' home was John Kennedy and Jackie, not Lincoln. And I didn't really become interested in Lincoln until the mid-90s, actually, when C-SPAN filmed the reenactment of the Lincoln-Douglas debate. And I worked with them just preparing for that series. And I was there to just talk to them about the Civil War era in general. And I became so fascinated with Lincoln that I have not turned back to my first love, which was the study of slavery and freedom in Southern Virginia. So I haven't done much on that since that time. So it's not a long time, not as long as some people have been involved with Lincoln, but it's long for me in terms of what I expect to do with my career.
Oops, going on 30 years since those debates. John Avlon, how about you?
I, as a kid, when I was very small, I had a series of books that my mother would read to me called Meet the Presidents, and one was on Lincoln. And that was probably the first time. And there were also the series also included Martin Luther King, but it was JFK, George Washington, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt. But then I remember, he always sort of was a figure that you could connect with when I was in college and reading the Lyceum speech for the first time. That really made an impression on me. And then I remember one day in particular, I was actually working at the 96 Democratic Convention in Chicago, and I worked, as a gopher, but basically for 48 hours straight. And when the circus left town, I had a free day, and I went to there was a Lincoln exhibit in Chicago at the time in a museum, and I bought David Herbert Donald's book Lincoln, and I brought it to Wrigley Field, and I spent a great ball game alone, alternately at Wrigley, alternately watching the game and reading the book, and then that book has been on my desk wherever I've worked ever since.
That's a good story. Sid, you've gone from the Clinton White House to, well, you're about to tackle the Lincoln White House in your books. How did that take over your life?
Well, I'm glad to hear anything about Wrigley Field, having grown up in Chicago, and remember the old Cubs. I grew up in Chicago, and Lincoln was a household god in Illinois when I was a boy, and he was still everywhere. My grandmother's cousin, a man named Sam Wiley, took me and my cousin Marilyn on a trip to Springfield when I was maybe 13. And we saw all the sights and all the shrines, and it made an enormous impression upon me. It was at the moment that I was awakening to American politics. It was about the time that John F. Kennedy had risen to the presidency. It was a campaign I was involved in as a runner for my precinct captain in Chicago, and had seen Kennedy at Chicago Stadium at the great Torchlight Parade. And Lincoln sort of was very much part of that. This was also at the time of the centennial of the Civil War, and I was very interested in all that, followed the books, and it was at the same time a new phase in the civil rights revolution, which also more than interested me. And I can remember removing at a very early age, after James Meredith was beaten attempting to integrate Ole Miss, removing the Confederate flags from my little Civil War flag set. So I went from there and read through Sandburg, and I've always retained a great interest in Lincoln, and have been very fortunate to have the time and space and ability to do this work.
You know, you and I have had parallel experiences. It must be that we're around the same age, because I had a father-son trip to Washington in 1961. And I was the monuments and museums that made an impression on me, especially was Ford's Theater, which at that point was the display of Lincoln artifacts, just vitrine after vitrine. It was not a remodeled theater at the time. So that did it for me, and for me as well, the centennial of the Civil War, which I still remember. And speaking of the intersection with the civil rights movement, I later found out President Kennedy was very interested in the centennial, brought in General Ulysses S. Grant the third or the fourth to say, so what are we doing for the opening guns, for April? And General Grant said, well, I hadn't really thought about it. And Kennedy got rid of General Grant, which Lincoln never did, and brought in another person to run the centennial. It was to open in Charleston. And he then found out that the one African-American member of the Centennial Commission would not be permitted to stay at the hotel with the other members. And I still remember this. I was 12 years old. Kennedy threw them all out of the hotel and made them stay at a military base in Charleston so that everyone could have equal housing. So made a big impression on me, all of that. Well, this series is unique. I've been involved in quite a few Lincoln documentaries over the decades, I guess. This one is very frank. This one allows a number of voices to speak about the dreams and disappointments that they have and Lincoln had. And I think people will be gripped by the appraisal and reappraisal that they're going to hear. We seem to be living in I don't know if it's a disconnect moment or a reappraisal moment. We hear Lincoln quotes ping-ponging across the aisle in the Senate and the House. We hear President Biden speaking about almost precisely the words that Lincoln spoke when he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He got one word wrong. It drove me crazy. At the same time, we're seeing schools that are named for Lincoln being renamed, the name called back. we're seeing statues being removed, including the Emancipation Group statue in Boston, a replica of the famous statue in Washington, D.C. So what is this complex moment all about? Is it reappraisal or is it Lincoln in the cancel culture? Um, let's go a different way this time and start with Sid.
Well, to some extent, I think that this reflects the period we're in. It's a period of great turmoil and stress and pain. It's a period of the pandemic. It's the period of Trump and Trumpism. It's the period of awareness of police brutality and the reaction to the murder of George Floyd. There's a break in society that's taken place, and there's also a lot of confusion about it. It's always positive for people to be interested in history and to learn from history. The question is, are they learning history, or are they simply engaging in a kind of impulsive reaction? You mentioned two instances, and I'd like to comment on them briefly. One is in Boston, the removal of the Emancipation Group statue, which shows Abraham Lincoln standing and a crouching, rising slave breaking his shackles beneath him, and Lincoln holding the Emancipation Proclamation. That statue was dedicated in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C. It is the first and only statue paid for by slaves. It was dedicated by the Black community in Washington, and Frederick Douglass delivered the oration at its dedication. When it was removed in Boston, some people regard it as condescending and demeaning the position of the slave. What they may not be aware of is that that symbolism is exactly the symbolism of the abolitionist movement. From its very beginnings in the anti-slavery movement in Britain, carried over to the abolitionist movement in the United States. It was the icon, the symbol of the Liberator newspaper published by William Lloyd Garrison, showing Jesus in the position of Lincoln with the slave and crouching, and the slogan was, am I not a brother? Am I not a man? And it was an early version of Black Lives Matter, and there's a rhyming in this history in that the gesture that many people make to try to elicit a feeling of sympathy and humanity about Black Lives Matter is kneeling. It is the exact position of the freed slave in this statue. I don't know if people are aware of that. So in Boston, this was dedicated by people who had founded the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. They were abolitionists. And there seems to be a kind of amnesia about history and what all this symbolism means. Let me just say one other thing about that symbol. The Christ figure in the Liberator's masthead was replaced by Lincoln. And the reason is not simply because Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which, by the way, he issued, as he pointed out in his preliminary draft, as to suppress insurrection. But it's also because Lincoln is a martyr and he had been assassinated. And so he is the Christ-like figure. And for those who lived through this and dedicated these statues, that memory was a living memory. And they believed that Lincoln had sacrificed his life for what he had done in the war and through emancipation. And so there's what was commonplace, what was the direct experience of people in its time, is something that people may need to recall and remember as they approach these statues that may appear strange or even offensive to them.
I think you're right about historical amnesia playing a major role in understanding or parsing or misunderstanding some of these not Confederate monuments, but Lincoln monuments. I want to ask Edna to weigh in because Edna, I know you grew up in the intimidating shadow of Confederate monuments, and maybe that would be a way to introduce your view of the iconoclasm that Lincoln is being subjected to, along with so many others.
Yeah, I don't think it's just an attack on Lincoln's reputation, but an attack in general on American symbols. Lincoln becomes important because Lincoln has always symbolized America's promise. And he certainly has for African Americans. His name has been used both by Black leaders and by non-Black leaders to to assure African Americans that things would be all right. But when you get to the times that we're living in, when the promise is not being realized, then the person that we have looked to as the architect of that promise, sort of gets the blame for it. It's not fair, but it's certainly it's what has occurred. But also too, I think that we need to remember that for a century and a half, Lincoln has been held up as godlike almost. We have been introduced to the sainted Lincoln, a person who was totally wedded to Black freedom, who had no ulterior motive for emancipation, someone who single-handedly freed the slaves. And as people realized that the man was much more complex than that, I think it's understandable that you would get this kind of reaction. And I agree that part of it is we don't know our history well enough. And apparently, if I think if we did, we wouldn't. You wouldn't see these attacks in the way that we've seen in the past year. But I think some of it does have to do with the fact that from decade after decade after decade, we've been fed with the idea that Abraham Lincoln was responsible for Black freedom, solely responsible for Black freedom, that no one else had anything to do with it. And so I think this is just a common reaction, not a very unusual reaction to that, to coming to the realization that Lincoln was not solely responsible, that many people were architects of Black freedom. So why wouldn't we see the kind of response that we're seeing, given the times we're living in, given the fact that the violence is really there in the streets in general. And so I don't know how we deal with that except to educate people about their history, about the history of the country, and to explain that you're going to have, you're not going to find anyone who's perfect. You're going to have people who are very complex. And it's that complexity, I think, that makes them fascinating historical figures.
John Avlon, how do we dovetail this reawakening to the complexity with the resurgence of citation of Lincoln everywhere you turn, from inaugural addresses to debates over the certification of an election that didn't really need a certification?
Well, I think that some of the anger and skepticism directed at Lincoln, we should acknowledge, but we should also understand it's somewhat on the fringes. I don't think the San Francisco School Board is a good proxy for America, let alone the left. And when statues of Lincoln are defaced in the context of riots and protests, well, it's ironic and unfortunate and frankly offensive to see a righteous movement to take down Confederate statues all of a sudden start occasionally toppling Frederick Douglass or Lincoln or Ulysses S. Grant. And those things need to be called out, and it's a broader part of civic education we need to engage in. Lincoln still, I think, is at the center of the American story. And I think, especially as the first round of founding fathers comes under scrutiny for many of them being slave owners, I think America's second founding, as it's been called, becomes more important. It becomes more central to the story because it's more inclusive and it's more relevant to the times we have. It should go without saying that figures from history aren't perfect. I mean, I understand, when you're graduating up the step ladder of civic education, there's a point where people go from mythic to human. And if that's jarring for some folks, that may be understandable, but they're infinitely more interesting when you take them off the pedestal, because that makes their wisdom much more accessible if you believe in applied history, if you enjoy applied history, which is I'm reading history to learn a great story, but also to learn lessons that maybe I can apply to my own life or to our own society at large. And that's certainly how I approach history to some extent. And Lincoln remains this great exception. He is a reconciler. The reason he's cited by presidents on both sides of divide, I think, speaks to his moral authority. But he understood that moral authority didn't confer moral superiority, that moral courage was about doing what was right, but not that his focus on reconciliation was not about assuming that he was better than anybody else. There was this sort of politics of the golden rule. There's so much about Lincoln as a unifying figure in the most divided time in American history. However under attack he came, his example of leadership, I think, still resonates, especially now, and maybe especially for a person like Biden, who has a specific task and a specific approach focusing on unity in a divided time. Because, as Sherman said, he almost uniquely captured goodness and greatness together. And those two qualities together, we aspire to. They're who we hope to be as a nation, but we don't always see in our leaders, to put it mildly. And I think that's the reason he holds has such a hold on our hearts as well as our heads as a country.
John Hirsch, you got to travel far and wide with cameras. You've got more than one statue in this documentary. I think I've only been to the Lincoln Memorial once at night, but you're there, night and day. How does it impress someone visually and symbolically as you look at it through your literal lens?
The Lincoln Memorial itself?
Yeah. And the whole notion of capturing these memorials. I know you did one in Chicago.
Sure.
Yeah.
It was important for us early on in the process of this to kind of look at it with very open eyes and open minds, and try to come from a place of, what do most people know about Lincoln, and what are the things that most people miss about Lincoln, which you've all touched on a little bit here. And I think that, believe it or not, my daughter, who was 7 at the time that this got greenlit and we started to really dig in, helped me really understand that, because she was just learning about library systems. And as soon as the idea of doing a Lincoln series came up, she started bringing home books unsolicited about Abraham Lincoln. And to John's point, the books themselves were so simplified and so much putting Lincoln on this pedestal without, and given these are written for elementary school kids, but you would think that Lincoln by himself emancipated the slaves, changed the country forever, and we all live happily ever after. And these aren't books from the 1940s or the 1950s that kids are reading in elementary school. These are books that were written very recently. And I was kind of alarmed by that. But to answer your question, Harold, it was important to me that, having traveled the country and traveled the world a lot for work and over the course of the time of my life, you see and you feel Lincoln in so many different ways, whether it's, the name on a school or a statue you didn't really know was there, or a street sign. Lincoln is, for lack of a better term, everywhere. And I wanted to find ways to capture that and bring that to people who are going to watch the show who may not have the opportunity to travel and may not have the opportunity to see these places and these incredible monuments to him in person. And the Lincoln Memorial was the one, that was sort of the one where I knew I wanted to do it in a couple of different ways. I wanted to capture it and feel it in a way that us as Americans feel it. In the middle of the day, there's thousands of people there. Some are just, on their daily runs running by it because they live around the corner. Some are there because they've traveled from the other side of the country to sort of feel this greatness and feel the power that this memorial has, both when you're standing at the bottom of the steps and right at Lincoln's feet and looking out, over the reflection pool. And there's just so much that you can feel in those moments. And I wanted to capture that both as just, for lack of a better term, a tourist, but then I also wanted to be there in the dead of night when it was absolutely empty to really, really just sort of be alone to some extent with Lincoln in this moment. So when we shot there, we did an overnight shoot, multi-cameras, and we began sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just as the light was getting good. And you'll see a lot of that in the show. But what really struck me, and what you see both opening the series in episode 1, and you see it again to close the series at the very end of episode 6, are these moments at 3 o'clock in the morning when the wind is dead, there's no light, and you're at the very, very far edge of the pool, and you see the monument reflecting in the water, and you're just like, having studied it and read it and living it and breathing it for the months I was before that shoot, it just, I had like a moment where I was like, wow, like, not only do I understand Lincoln's story, the journey he went through, the changes he made, all the incredible hardships and accomplishments that he had throughout his life, but also here we are, all this time later, and that power can still be felt, and that power can still be meaningful. And that's why we see, politicians on both sides quoting him left and right. They understand the power. Edna makes that point very well in the show about very well in the cold open of episode 1, how politicians understand the weight and the power of his name and his words, and they use it to their advantage. And there's no denying that. But there was this moment at 3 o'clock in the morning that I hope when people watch it at home can sort of have a reflection like I did. And if they do, then I've sort of done my job, or I've done part of my job, and because I certainly felt it at 3 o'clock in the morning.
One of the complications of history that everyone is addressing tonight. There is a moment in the story of the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial, which is coming on 99 years this May. There was an African American who was among the speakers that day. That's the good news. The bad news is that his comments, in which he said in part, and I'm paraphrasing, until the unfinished work that Lincoln talked about is completed, we do not have the kind of democracy that Lincoln promised us. Warren Harding and his administration gave him a choice. The man is Robert Russell Moton, who was the director of the Tuskegee Institute. Principal, I think, is the title. And he was told either cut that out or don't speak. And he had to make a difficult decision and chose to give a censored speech so that the white sponsors of the dedication would be satisfied. So yes, absolutely a complex history. Thank you for sharing your impressions. I love hearing about how people react to the memorial, which itself is an icon that actually goes beyond Lincoln. It's a sort of a setting for protest and innovation in America. I want to talk for a minute, because it's such a rich and obvious thing for us to address at this moment, where as we speak, it's less than 4 weeks since a new president was inaugurated, and just a few weeks since an insurrection at the Capitol. Let's go back and remind the people who are viewing what happened when the electoral count was certified for Abraham Lincoln in 1861, and then what happened after an inaugural dedicated to the better angels, because we've been speaking about echoes and lessons, and this part is painful. John, why don't you start this round? Avalon.
Sure. So I think one of the points that makes Lincoln's story really resonant to right now is an aspect of how he comes into office that we underappreciate, gets a little bit overwhelmed by the secession and slavery, which was the immediate reaction of his election as a new president, new political party, was the secession of 7 states before he takes the oath. And one of the purposes of the war,
Mhm.
especially at the outset, early on, Lincoln says, we must show the world that there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet. And that's a really resonant phrase, especially right now. The refusal to accept the legitimacy of Lincoln's election. It was less than 40% of the popular vote. The Democratic Party split into 2, 3 almost, candidacies. So it was a very fractured field. His name wasn't even on the ballot in the South. But the prospect of Lincoln being elected on the Republican Party, despite the fact that he was a moderate on slavery within the context of the time, and he was simply, as he said in the first inaugural, he was simply saying that he opposes the expansion of slavery, right? And he may personally oppose slavery, but he didn't believe the presidency was imbued with the power to overturn it constitutionally. Ironically, the war that the secessionists started would end slavery, which is the thing they were afraid of. But that aspect and the posture of aggressive defensiveness that was cultivated by Southern secessionists over decades, the violence and the threats on the floor of the Capitol, the disproportionate influence and power that Southern Democrats had because of the 3/5 clause and other things. All these conspire to this moment. But the fact that fundamentally that first spark, yes, it's about slavery and the expansion of slavery, but it's also about Southern Democrats refusing to accept the legitimacy of Lincoln's election and responding with violence. That doesn't get much more resonant than that.
Right. Sydney, I know you've thought a lot about this. We've talked about this. Some of the precautions and really security measures that were brought to bear for Lincoln's, for the electoral vote certification moment, and later for the inaugural, a lesson that was lost on the preparation for the certification this time around.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say that everyone who's interested in this period should read your book, President-elect Lincoln. It's an excellent book on the
Thank you.
transition and what Lincoln did and thought in this period. The first inaugural was surrounded by the U.S. military and the Army with snipers around the Capitol. Lincoln's life was threatened. There was an almost successful assassination attempt on Lincoln's life as he passed through Baltimore on his way to Washington. He had to travel incognito in night, change trains, adopt a disguise for which he was later ridiculed. But the assassination attempt was quite real. And no one quite knew whether the Capitol, the city of Washington itself, was secure or safe. And there was an open question of whether Lincoln would be even allowed to take the oath of office as president during this insurrection. The South Carolina Ordinance of Secession states that the reason is the election itself of Lincoln. And it quotes from his speeches and says, this is a man who has said that the United States cannot be half slave and half free, and that he had declared that he would put slavery on the course of ultimate extinction. And those quotes are in the South Carolina Ordinance. Flash forward to 1864, and the reason I'm reminding people of this is because we have seen the vivid pictures of our Capitol under siege, and we have images of that very building. And imagine now it's 1864. The dome has been completed. It was under construction for years, and completed by Lincoln as a symbol of the Union. And here is Lincoln, and we're in a different period than 1861. We're in 1865, and Lincoln orders that units of Black troops, Black regiments appear before him. They are also guards, but they are present now in Union uniform. That is a transformative event. It directly derives from his Emancipation Proclamation, in which he orders the recruitment of Blacks into the US military. And that is one of the most important ways by which Blacks have achieved citizenship and civil rights throughout US history, is through the US military. And we must also remember who is lurking above Lincoln, hiding in plain sight and watching him, John Wilkes Booth, determined to kill him even then. And the spirit of insurrection had turned to a spirit of assassination and vengeance. And now we see what has happened to our capital today. And the Lincoln, those two Lincoln frames from 61 and 65 of those inaugurals are very illuminating about our own times. The great cliche about Lincoln is there's nothing new to say about Lincoln, and there's always something new to say about Lincoln.
You know, it's interesting that you're right. The first inaugural was guarded very carefully, and the second, I think Booth's move was actually, although he appears, we think he appears in the photograph of Lincoln speaking, looming above him, but there was an incident in the rotunda when Lincoln passed through from the Senate chamber, where Andrew Johnson was sworn in as vice president, toward the portico, when a man lunged toward him and was restrained by Capitol Police. I think that was the moment when Booth was going to attack, and it probably was a closer call than many people think. One other anecdote, and then I'm going to ask Edna to weigh in. But there were so many African Americans in uniform at that second inaugural that Lincoln experienced something. It was later said that he hadn't experienced since he left his childhood Baptist church in Kentucky, and that is there were shoutbacks for some of the things he was saying, particularly the long penultimate sentence about the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And people were shouting back, which was not customary. Applause, yes, but these were amens. And I think Lincoln was very touched by it. Edna, what this scary moment of passage. I'm reminded that Frederick Douglass said after Baltimore that now Lincoln knows what the Underground Railroad must have been like, now that he has taken an Underground Railroad to get to Washington.
Yeah.
But clearly his anti-slavery was enough to convince 7 states that he could never preside. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. But it's interesting that in that first inaugural address, he's very conciliatory. He says exactly what he needs to say, I think, to calm the Confederacy down. It's not enough for them, of course, but he gives it that shot. There's a great deal of disappointment on the part of certain groups, especially in the North, that Lincoln was so conciliatory. African Americans are especially concerned because they had assumed that because Lincoln was anti-slavery, not an abolitionist, but anti-slavery at that time, and because the Confederacy had been formed, secession had occurred, at least with those 7 states, that Lincoln would use that as an opportunity to do something about slavery. So they were very disappointed when in his address he said that he had no intention of doing anything with slavery, and he didn't think that he had the constitutional right to do anything. And I think what was most upsetting to people was his pledge, really, to defend the rights of the Southerners, including the slaveholders. And he was going to make sure that the fugitive slave law was enforced as long as it didn't lead to attacks on free people of color. Now, we historians know that forever, it seems, free people of color were attacked. They were being taken up and enslaved. And if they weren't already in the South, they were shipped to the South. So Lincoln could not have possibly thought that this was not going to happen. So you had abolitionists and other people who were freedom lovers being very concerned that Lincoln was willing to concede that to the Confederacy. And of course, there was the concern too that Lincoln said he was not going to use force against them except to protect federal property. And so, as much as we are enamored with that speech, and there are lots of things in there to be enamored about, there were people during Lincoln's time that didn't feel that this was something that the President of the United States should be promising to people who had attempted to dissolve the Union.
And Douglas said that, of course, he severely criticized the first inaugural. John Hirsch, you've had to use the words and the images. You're a very good image guy because you're like Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, that famous movie, against a window. You're going from sun to sunset in your background there. I'm very impressed. Tell us how you melded the words and pictures, and also I think our viewers, and we have hundreds of them tonight, I'm told, we would love to hear more about our narrator for the series.
Sure. Where would you like me to start?
Well, I guess the narrator part is the easiest, right? Then you can go into.
Well, choosing the right narrator for any project is always a difficult decision. This one was not, because although we had many conversations about trying to find someone who had a connection to the material, someone who had maybe done a film, that was Civil War era or been involved in big projects like that. At the end of the day, we just wanted someone who we knew had a voice, the right voice, to sort of capture all the different tones and tenors of this story, the highs and lows, the funny and the tragic, and of course capture Lincoln's own words, both funny and very serious as well. And Sterling K. Brown was someone that we had been talking about for quite a while, but we didn't think we could get him. And then through a friend of a friend, I got connected with his agent, reached out, wrote a letter, told the agent about the project, and the next thing I knew, about 48 hours later, I was on the phone with Sterling talking about the project. And it turns out that he's a bit of an American history buff. He knows quite a bit of the history and the nuance of the times and the nuance of the Lincoln story. And it just felt like a very natural fit. And we kind of hit it off on the phone. And from there, it was probably the easiest negotiation I've ever had as a producer with an A-list actor to get them to do anything. And he was great. I think he did a terrific job, and I couldn't be happier with landing on Sterling. He was just a joy to work with, and I think he does the story right.
Well, it's beautiful. It sounds beautiful for sure. He does the words. I love hearing people speaking Lincoln's words who haven't spoken them, at least in my presence or on my screen before. There are new nuances that emerge from a professional reading by someone who cares. I think it comes through.
Yeah.
I see my pal Mac is in screen, ready to pop in, and I also see a lot of questions from the audience. So Mac, why don't we spend some time hearing what our viewers are asking about?
Yes, thanks, Harold. We do have lots of good questions. Here's one for anyone who cares to answer it, from Sean Dale. Which misconception about or criticism of Lincoln irritates you the most?
The history of Lincoln detractors is as long as the history of those who worship Lincoln. And there are two schools of thought. One is that Lincoln was a tyrant who stamped out civil liberties because he suspended habeas corpus and so on in order to, during the war. And then there are those, and it's a fairly recent school of thought that Lincoln was indifferent to slavery and that he was forced to deal with it. Lincoln said, I've always been naturally against slavery. And he made many statements about slavery being wrong. Lincoln was a practical politician at the same time that he was opposed to slavery. It was a very difficult situation. And if you think that today we have to deal with virulent racism, it was that much worse in Lincoln's day. And he was very conscious of the racism of its time and its political expression. And he had to work under the most difficult circumstances in order to achieve his goals. And if there's a lesson for our current president, President Biden, it is how Lincoln upheld principle at the same time that he managed the politics. And I believe that that Biden may be aware of that as he cites Lincoln about unity, because Lincoln always believed, as he stated in his most distilled form in his second inaugural, that unity did not come without justice.
That's great. If anybody, unless anybody else has something on that, I'll move on. Okay.
Actually, CNN did asked for some very brief response to that very answer for something they're putting out tomorrow. And Sydney has just unconsciously or intentionally quoted almost exactly what I wrote about my issue with the indifference, the charge that he was indifferent to slavery. So, Sydney, either you've read it in advance or great minds think alike. I don't know.
Indeed.
Mac, let's have another question.
This one is being asked of Mr. Hirsch. Robert Keston asks, what was the most surprising thing you learned as you put the film together? I suppose about Lincoln.
I mean, that is a loaded question in itself. The most surprising thing. I think that, more than anything, it's probably, Lincoln's own words that are probably, some of the more racist things he said early in his political career on public stages. I think that I was taken aback by the language that he chose when, pressured to comment on equality and the differences, inherent differences at the time, or that he believed between the black and white races. I think that is something that I'll probably never shake, reading it for the first time and really, taking it in and thinking about it not just in those times, but in our times, back to the question from earlier. And we don't shy away from that in the project, in the series. We get into it, really throughout, and it's important to understand where he began on race and so you understand where he lands and where he ends and how he got there. But yeah, I think, to be frank, that I was taken aback and I still am.
Okay, here's a question from David Andrews. It's a very specific question. Given the attacks on Lincoln's life during his presidency, why was he not accompanied by guards who might have protected him from assassination at Ford's Theater?
Well, people have been speculating about that for generations pretty wildly. The fact is, America let its guard down. There was no Secret Service. He did have a guard, but the guard was having a drink. And when John Wilkes Booth arrived at the box at Ford's Theater, he presented his card and was admitted into the outer vestibule. He was famous enough as a celebrity actor, an A-list actor, as John Hirsch would say, to gain admission. That's a long, long story. And of course, it's the great American tragedy.
I would just add one small anecdote to Harold's account, which is that Lincoln invited many people that night to come with him to the theater, and many of them refused, including General Grant, whose wife disliked Mary Lincoln. And Grant took a railroad train north out of town. Had Grant been there, Grant was unaware that his general staff had surrounded him with a guard. Grant had not wanted a guard to protect himself in that way, but he had a secretive guard, and had Grant attended, there's no question that Lincoln would have been protected unknowingly. So there are many what ifs of history involving that night and many other incidents.
And Grant had been menaced earlier in the day by Booth, who
Yeah.
rode past his carriage and then around the carriage. I'm not sure how secure the guard ring was because he was right in Grant's face on a horse, and Julia was Grant's wife was upset. So again, we'll never know.
This is another what if on that subject from Cheryl Nagel Smiley. If he had not been assassinated, how do you feel Reconstruction would have been different?
Edna, why don't you try this one?
Yeah, I was about to say, let me take that one because I probably differ from most people. I think that most historians believe that had Lincoln lived, he would have ensured that the newly emancipated were protected, that they would have received equal rights quicker than they did. I don't think that's the case. I think that at the end of the war, he was so worn out. All he wanted was peace between the two parts of the country. And I think that he would have been willing to compromise. We know already what his plan for Reconstruction looked like. And he was even willing to allow the South, former slaveholders, to sort of dictate how African Americans would live until they had worked themselves their way into a new relationship, as he called it. Now, he said that if things got out of hand, he could intervene, but I'm not so sure he would have been willing to do very much to the South as they attempted to get the newly emancipated under their thumb. And I think because he was assassinated, and because you had someone in the White House who was totally unqualified for the position, that forced Congress to do something about what was happening to the free people in the South. And as a consequence of that, they got certain rights that they would not have gotten quite as quickly. And so I don't think the 14th Amendment would have been passed as quickly as it was, or the 15th for that matter. So I think that given Lincoln's personality, his willingness to compromise, I think it would have been a tough road for African Americans. I mean, it was tough enough already. And of course, Reconstruction in the end was not successful because it was abandoned. But I can imagine that Lincoln would have done what the radicals in Congress did. And certainly if he had been in position as president, they would not have been able to get those measures passed as easily as they were able to with Andrew Johnson.
So can I jump in there and offer an alternate respectfully? So I think you're absolutely right about the political momentum behind the 14th and the 15th Amendment. Lincoln definitely was focused on state by state reconstruction. And he wanted the states to build up. He had a quote unquote liberal view of Reconstruction. But I think there are important differences between Johnson and Lincoln politically and in terms of what Johnson encouraged and enabled in the South. In particular, as the Black Codes get passed in the summer and fall of 1865, it doesn't help that Johnson, who a lot of the radicals thought was an ally but really wasn't, is viciously racist and absolutely wants to enable those Black Codes and is fighting from the beginning. I mean, he vetoes the Civil Rights Act. I don't think Lincoln would not have done that. The Freedmen's Bureau, which Lincoln had set up, which was supposed to be an important vehicle under O.O. Howard, of course, to transition refugees to independence, that gets gutted. And so then you have this pendulum swing between the radicals and Johnson. But I think Johnson's instincts around empowering the South went well beyond, aggressively so, with what Lincoln had in mind. And I do think these are counterfactuals, but I think that there would have been more of an emphasis on enforcing the rights of freed peoples through the Freedmen's Bureaus and through the military if necessary than what Johnson did, which is essentially, give the game away to the South. So all of a sudden you've got former Confederates getting elected to Congress right away. I don't think there's any indication Lincoln would have allowed that.
Just,
don't know
just
that
to, yeah, I'm sorry. And can I just make one,
Sure.
use a quote to make a slightly different point. Um, in his Reconstruction speech, which we know as his last speech, but he didn't know it was his last speech, Lincoln said that the time might have come to offer the right to vote to African American men, of course, not women. That is the very intelligent and those who have fought in the army, which of course sounds like hideous means testing and uh, sounds terribly conservative and backward. But at the time was the first time any American president had spoken about black suffrage from the presidency. Um, in the crowd that night, outside the White House, stood John Wilkes Booth with one of his small C Confederates. And Booth is said, at least there are two sources, one, the impeachment proceedings against Andrew Johnson, another, a novel with a footnote. Johnson turned to his ally and said, that means Negro equality, and he did not use that word. That's the last speech he'll ever make. So I think Lincoln had a goal in mind, but as we know, he led from behind. He was very slow in his way. As he always said, I put my big foot down slowly, but when I do, I never walk backwards. And it might have been a longer process. I think Edna Medford is right about that. But maybe if he had been allowed to complete the revolution of the 1860s, we might not have had to wait for the 1960s for the dream to be
and
fulfilled.
we're still waiting. And
I know.
Um,
Do we have time for a couple more, Mac?
yeah, so Bill Cunningham cites the rather mean quote of Oliver Wendell Holmes about FDR, that he had a second-rate intellect but a first-rate temperament. How would you rate Lincoln as a military leader, considering he had almost no military training? First rate or what?
I think he did what he did all his life. When he wanted to learn Shakespeare, he, got the collected works of Shakespeare. Actually, he got a book called Scott's Elocution first and memorized the soliloquies, and memorized the Bible and taught himself the law and passed the bar. And so when the conflict begins, he orders up books from the Library of Congress. General Halleck's book on military strategy, he would later use Halleck as his general in chief, and Halleck didn't understand military strategy as much as Lincoln did. By the end of the war, he's innovating things like joint action and simultaneous action and using the Army and Navy together, which had never been done. So he's just an extraordinary autodidact. So I would rank him as a great commander in chief. I mean, the sacrifice was immense and he didn't expect it, but he by the end of the war, he got it. He understood strategy.
I'd like to say two things about that briefly. One is that Lincoln had terrible trouble with his military commanders, particularly George McClellan, who was head of the Army of the Potomac and actually created it. There was no real Union Army on a mass scale when the war broke out, and it had to be created and trained, and Lincoln allowed McClellan, who was one of the few West Pointers who stayed loyal and was a Northerner, to do that. McClellan was also a very political general, and the military was very political. He was connected to conservative Democratic circles in New York. He was deeply opposed to emancipation and delivered to Lincoln an ultimatum against it. So that's one part. And it took Lincoln a long time, and it's a long story and a great story to get to Grant. The other thing about Lincoln as military commander is that he was a man of science. He's the only president to hold a patent. And it seems a little quaint, but Lincoln was deeply involved in the development of modern technology and through warfare. He spent a lot of time with the Secretary of the Smithsonian. He created the National Academy of Science, and he participated in the boards and the building of the most advanced weaponry, including the Monitor class of naval vessels. And he understood how all of this worked. He was, just as a footnote, also deeply interested in public health. And the US Sanitary Commission was de facto the first national public health service, a public-private enterprise that Lincoln was involved in. And so there were great national institutions that were created that grew out of the war. And Lincoln's was more than an interest in science. He was a man of science, was very important to the outcome and the prosecution of the war.
And if that sounds harsh, it was when someone asked Lincoln once if his interest in niter, which was kind of an early version of napalm, was a bit beyond the pale. He said, "This war is not going to be won with elder squirts and rose water." Look up elder squirts. It's an interesting phrase, but he was pretty tough when it came to applying science to deadly technology.
But he also innovated the Libra codes, which became the basis for the Geneva Conventions, were used even in Nuremberg. So
Good point, John. Absolutely.
It's also important to note that during this time, his incredible capacity for compassion for the families of fallen soldiers, the letters he wrote to people who had lost their husbands, children that had lost their fathers. So he really is, he runs the spectrum of just this incredible capacity to be compassionate and understanding of the destruction of the war, but yet understanding the advances needed to win the war. And I think that that's one of the most important things to understand about Lincoln specifically, regarding this question.
It's a great point. Mac, think of one
Yep.
great final question.
Sure. There are a few here that are about then versus now. I'll combine those into one question. Were there attempts to void Lincoln's 1860 election, and what parallels do you see in the political rhetoric in the period between election and inauguration in 1860 and 2020?
I think the ultimate effort to avoid it is creating an alternative universe. There was another country and another president and another inaugural journey simultaneous to Lincoln's inaugural journey and inauguration. That seems to be the ultimate resistance. And I would say the rebellion counts as well. But I don't want to have the last word, so I think my colleagues should weigh in. Or not.
Well,
Let me just say that I am always struck by the Lyceum speech in 1838, where he's talking about demagogues and how the rule of law is so important and that we should protect that and defend that. When you look at that speech, it's almost like it's so precious. It looks like he is in the 21st century, looking at what we're doing now and commenting on it. And when he says the destruction of American democracy will not be an external thing, it'll be internal. It is just so precious to see that even in 1838, he recognized the danger to American democracy.
I'll add one thing on the rhetoric or between, after Lincoln won and now. There are a lot of parallels. I mean, conservative populists were Democrats then, and were in the South, but the tactics that were used, I mentioned aggressive defensiveness, and it was basically a posture that said, the slave owning South felt that their way of life was under attack. And so they were aggressive from a feeling of defensiveness. They felt demographic change was squeezing them out. I'm being generous in some respects. And you had all the rhetoric of, in their mind, it's mind-boggling, but they were fighting for liberty, they believed. Constitutional liberty was their terminology. This is what Lincoln called the Wolf's Dictionary. We don't have a common definition of liberty. And you see direct strains, even through the militia movements, so-called, today, and some of that rhetoric and tactics. It's really very resonant. And I think part of the danger of Donald Trump's big lie, David Blight's written about this, and I've spoken about it a little bit, is that we see the potential for the creation of a new lost cause mythology, where and it doesn't have the scope and depth perhaps, but it's this fiction that they weren't really defeated, and therefore a refusal to recognize defeat, and that kind of an alternate reality and a mythology that, if it gets coddled, can really metastasize into something even more dangerous.
Edna pointed out Lincoln's Springfield Lyceum speech, his first real formal speech as a young man, in which he denounces mob violence. And one of the incidents he has in mind is the murder by a mob of an abolitionist newspaper editor and minister, Elijah P. Lovejoy, in Illinois, Alton, Illinois. Fast forward, it is after Lincoln has issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and there's immense opposition to it. And there's immense opposition in the North. There's a lot of war weariness, and there's a major part of the then Democratic Party that was pro-Confederate and wanted Lincoln to recognize the Confederacy and end the war. They were called Copperheads. And I think John has referred to them as how they seized the banner of liberty against the tyrant Lincoln. Lincoln writes a letter to a rally in Springfield to try and mobilize a pro-union sentiment. And it is one of his most explicit statements against white supremacy. And he says, you don't like me because I'm for Negro rights and I've issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And he says, well, you can fight for yourselves for the Union, but you ought to recognize that the blacks who are now fighting in the Union Army are fighting for your freedom as well. And they also have their own motives. And Lincoln says, the promise made, the promise must be kept to them. And he warns the country about whites who have mean-spirited hearts, who do not recognize the motives of blacks who are fighting not only for their own freedom, but for the freedom of the whole nation. And it's one of his least recognized and most relevant and contemporary statements. So there's always something to learn in Lincoln.
Yeah, that is a great quote. Malignant hearts and deceitful speech, which we're seeing some evidence of in the rancor today. I know everyone has hung in long past the time I promised we would be able to go to our dinners and other plans, but I wanted to end with a Lincoln quote. We've had some great ones today. I thought a little bit about right makes might, because after all, it was delivered in New York City. But I decided to offer a quote from that same first inaugural, because we're all in a immediate post-inaugural moment. So with great thanks to John Avlon and Sidney Blumenthal and Edna Green Medford and John Hirsch, and all of you who have asked such great questions, let me end with this line, which is in the middle of the speech, so it's rarely quoted, but I think applicable. Why should we not have a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people? Is there any better or equal hope in the world? So with that, thank you all and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.